I never thought buying my dream home would turn into a war. When I first moved into the neighborhood, I imagined peace, family barbecues, friendly neighbors, and a place where my kids could grow up without worry. It was one of those communities that looked picture-perfect: clean sidewalks, trimmed lawns, and houses lined up like they had come straight out of a real estate magazine. The kind of place where you'd think everyone smiled at each other and helped when you needed a hand. But behind that perfect white fence and freshly painted mailbox was something darker. Something people didn't talk about openly. The HOA. At first, I thought they were just a formality, a group of volunteers making sure the community stayed nice. I mean, how bad could a group of neighbors be? They looked polite, waved when I drove by, and even dropped off a welcome packet when I signed my papers. It felt safe. Almost too safe. I had always been passionate about renewable energy. Before even moving in, I knew I wanted solar panels on my roof. It wasn't just about saving money. It was about being independent, being responsible, and reducing the bills that always seemed to creep higher every year. My old house had them, and I couldn't imagine living without that freedom again. So naturally, after moving in, I contacted a solar company, got a free quote, and started planning. The day the first set of equipment was delivered, I noticed something strange. A white SUV stopped in front of my driveway. Inside, 2 people were scribbling notes. They weren't from the solar company, and I didn't recognize them. The moment they saw me walking toward them, they drove off. I brushed it off as nosy neighbors. After all, new people in the community always attracted attention. But a few days later, the letter came. Plain white envelope with the HOA logo stamped across the top. I opened it casually, thinking it might be about trash pickup or landscaping rules. Instead, it was a warning. Dear homeowner, it has come to our attention that you are attempting to install solar panels on your property. Please be advised that such modifications are prohibited under our community guidelines. Failure to comply will result in fines of up to $500 per week until removed. My heart sank, but then anger took over. Prohibited. How could they prohibit solar panels? It didn't make sense. I pulled out the community handbook they gave me when I moved in. Sure enough, there was a vague section about exterior modifications requiring approval. But nothing about solar specifically. Nothing at all. I decided to call the HOA office. A woman with a clipped, professional tone answered. When I explained the situation, she responded like she'd said it 1,000 times before. Sir, solar panels are not permitted. They do not conform with the aesthetic of our community. I pressed her. Where exactly is that in the bylaws? I read the handbook. There's no mention of solar panels. She hesitated. Then, after a pause, she said, the board has final discretion on exterior modifications. You are expected to remove the panels immediately. That was the moment I realized this wasn't going to be easy. Neighbors began whispering. At first, it was supportive people saying things like, good for you, I've wanted solar too, but they always shut it down. Then the darker stories came out. Families who had been fined into submission, others who had moved out entirely. After fighting the HOA, one man who said they made his life a living hell just because he planted vegetables in his front yard. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, they were enforcing control. And now, they had chosen me as their target. I wasn't going to roll over. I spent hours online researching state and federal solar rights laws. That's when I stumbled on something incredible. In my state, there was a law called the Solar Access Act. It specifically prohibited HOAs from banning solar energy systems. They could regulate placement to a degree, but they couldn't outright ban them. Even better, at the federal level, there were energy policies designed to encourage renewable adoption, and HOAs weren't above those laws. Suddenly, their threats didn't scare me, They enraged me. Because now I knew they were bluffing. Worse, they were breaking the law themselves. But before I made my move, I kept quiet. I wanted to see just how far they would push me. A week later, another letter arrived. This one was harsher. It stated that because I had not complied, I was being fined $250 already, with another $500 due by the end of the week. The letter also mentioned possible liens on my home if the violation continued. They were escalating. That night at the community meeting, I showed up. I walked into the clubhouse, a room filled with folding chairs, a podium at the front, and a few dozen residents murmuring quietly. At the head of the table sat the HOA board, 3 men and 2 women, dressed like they were about to judge a courtroom case. Their expressions were cold, unwelcoming. The president, a tall man with slicked-back gray hair, spoke first. "Mr. Carter, we've received reports about your unauthorized installation. You're in violation of community standards." I didn't argue right away. Instead, I asked, calmly, "Can you show me where, in writing, it states solar panels are prohibited?" He adjusted his glasses and shuffled papers. As stated, the board reserves final discretion over exterior appearances. "That's not what I asked," I said. My voice was steady, but the tension in the room was heavy. "Show me where. Solar panels are prohibited." The room went silent. Some residents looked down. Others shifted uncomfortably. The president cleared his throat and said, "Regardless, the board has spoken. You're required to remove them." That was the moment I smiled, because I knew what they didn't. They were about to walk right into a trap. I told them I would. Comply for now. But inside, I was already planning my next move. I was going to take their own arrogance and turn it against them. I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to prove, publicly, that the HOA was breaking federal energy laws. And when I was done, they'd regret ever thinking they could bully me. And that was just the beginning. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a stack of documents, my laptop glowing, and a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. I wasn't reading for pleasure. I was digging through legal codes, government energy websites, and case studies from across the country. What I found made my blood boil even more. For years, HOAs had been trying to block solar panels under the excuse of community aesthetics. But court after court had struck them down. Judges had ruled that homeowners had the right to generate renewable energy, and HOA rules could not override state or federal law. In fact, I found a Supreme Court case from a few years back that clearly stated homeowners had the right to reasonable solar access. That was my golden ticket. But I didn't want to just show up with laws printed on paper. I wanted to hit them where it hurt. That meant finding out why they were so desperate to block solar in the first place. So I started asking questions around the neighborhood. Quietly, casually, like I was just curious. And what I heard shocked me. A couple of neighbors admitted that years ago, 2 families had tried to install solar panels. The HOA shut them down with threats of massive fines. One of those families actually sued, but suddenly dropped the case. Rumor had it they were paid off. The other family, they moved out. Their house was sold within months, and the HOA rewrote the bylaws after they left. But the most disturbing thing I learned came from an older neighbor named Linda. She pulled me aside one evening as I was checking the mail. She whispered, "Be careful. The HOA president has a brother-in-law who works for an energy company. That's why they hate solar. It cuts into profits." Suddenly, everything made sense. Oh. This wasn't about aesthetics. It wasn't about rules. It was about money. If homeowners went solar, they'd buy less electricity. And if the HOA leadership had financial ties to that company, then blocking solar wasn't just illegal, it was corruption. That night, started digging deeper into the HOA board members themselves. Public records, company filings, news articles, anything I could find. And sure enough, the president of the HOA was connected to a consulting firm that just happened to receive contracts from the very same energy company Linda mentioned. The pieces were fitting together like a puzzle, and I was building my case. But the HOA wasn't sitting quietly either. They started stepping up their intimidation. I found anonymous notes taped to my door. Take them down or else. My mailbox was smashed one night, and one morning I woke up to see my trash cans tipped over and garbage scattered across my lawn. They were trying to break me down, scare me into submission. But every time they pushed harder, I pushed back stronger. Documented everything. I saved every letter, photographed every act of vandalism, and recorded every conversation with the HOA. Then came the turning point. Another official letter. Only this time, it wasn't just about fines. It was a notice of intent to place a lien on my property if I didn't remove the panels and pay their so-called fees. They claimed they could start the process to take my home. That was the last straw. I scheduled a meeting with a lawyer the very next day. I laid everything out on his desk, the laws, the photographs, the laws I had found. He looked through it all and leaned back in his chair. Then he said the words I had been waiting to hear. They don't have a case. In fact, what they're doing is illegal. Not only can we stop them, but if you want, we can go after them for damages. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt hope. Not just hope, I felt fire. They thought they could bully me. They thought they could break me. But now, I had the law on my side, and I had proof they were acting in bad faith, so I made a plan. I wouldn't just defend myself quietly. I was going to expose them publicly in front of every single homeowner in the community. And when the next HOA meeting came around, I showed up with a thick binder under my arm. Inside were copies of federal and state solar access laws, evidence of their intimidation tactics, and documentation of their shady ties to the energy company. This wasn't just going to be a meeting. This was going to be a war. The night of the HOA meeting, the air felt heavier than usual. Cars lined both sides of the street leading to the clubhouse, and you could hear the chatter of neighbors long before stepping inside. People knew something was coming. They had heard whispers about my fight, and some were curious, while others seemed nervous. Like they already knew what happened when someone stood up to the board. I walked in carrying my binder. And immediately, I felt all eyes on me. The board members were already seated at their long folding table up front. Their papers stacked neatly, water bottles lined up, nameplates shining under the fluorescent lights. The president, slicked back hair and smug grin, pretended not to notice me, but I caught the quick glance he gave to one of the other board members. It was the kind of look people share when they're already plotting their next move. The meeting started like it always did. Mundane announcements about landscaping, trash pickup schedules, and minor complaints. But the tension in the room was undeniable, and it built with every passing minute. Finally, the president cleared his throat. Before we conclude, he said, we must address a serious violation. Mr. Carter, would you please step forward? The room went quiet. I stood carrying my binder and walked to the center of the room. The president didn't even look at me when he spoke. You've been warned multiple times regarding your unauthorized installation of solar panels. You are in violation of community standards, and fines will continue to accrue until you comply. I let him finish. Then I opened my binder. My voice was calm, steady. Actually, I'm not in violation of anything, and I can prove it. That got the room's attention. Neighbors leaned forward in their chairs. The president frowned, shuffling his papers like he could somehow find a rule that would back him up. I held up a copy of the state Solar Access Act. This is state law. It specifically prohibits homeowners associations from banning solar panels. You may regulate reasonable placement, but you cannot ban them outright. Your letters, your fines, your threats of a lien, they're all illegal. Murmurs filled the room. One of the board members shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the president. But I wasn't finished. I flipped to another section of my binder, and here's federal law. The Energy Policy Act, as well as Department of Energy guidelines, both encourage residential solar adoption. What you're doing isn't just against state lit, goes against federal energy policy. I could see the president's jaw tighten. He tried to interrupt, but I raised my voice just enough. No, you're going to listen, because this doesn't stop with me. I've spoken to neighbors who were also denied solar in the past, families who were threatened, fined, and intimidated. Some of them even moved away because of this board. That's not governance, that's abuse. The room was buzzing now. Neighbors whispering to each other, heads nodding. Some looking angry, but not at me, angry at the board. Then I delivered the bombshell. I slid a few printed pages across the table. These are public records showing financial ties between your consulting firm and an energy company that benefits when solar adoption is blocked. You told this community it was about aesthetics. But the truth is, you've been protecting profits, not property values. You've been lying to everyone here. Gasps echoed through the room. A woman in the back stood up and said loudly, "Is that true?" Another man shouted, "We've been paying dues for this, for corruption." The board president's face turned red. He slammed his hand on the table. "This is out of order. You have no proof of wrongdoing." I met his glare. "I have all the proof I need. And if you don't back down right now, I'll be filing a formal complaint with the state Attorney General's office. You've broken the law and you've abused your power. I'm not afraid of you. And you should be very afraid of what happens next." The silence that followed was deafening. The board members sat frozen, their authority crumbling in front of the very people they had ruled over for years. Then, something remarkable happened. A few neighbors began clapping. At first, just one or two. Then, more joined in. Within seconds, half the room was applauding, cheering even, while the board sat there in stunned silence. I closed my binder and stepped back. I had said what needed to be said. The rest, I knew, would play out soon enough. But deep down, I also knew this battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because people like the HOA board didn't just give up power easily. They'd fight, they'd scheme, they'd try new tactics. And I was ready for all of it. The day of the court hearing, the courthouse steps felt heavier beneath my feet. My binder of evidence letters, photos, legal statutes was tucked under my arm like a shield. My lawyer walked beside me, calm and collected, but I could feel the weight of everything pressing down. This wasn't just about solar panels anymore. This was about exposing the truth. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with quiet whispers. A few neighbors had shown up, curious to see what would happen. On the other side of the aisle, the HOA board sat stiffly in their suits. The president glaring at me like he wanted to burn a hole through my chest. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The HOA's attorney went first. He tried to paint me as a defiant homeowner who refused to follow community rules. He waved their bylaws like they were sacred scripture and argued that I was disrupting the uniform look and feel of the neighborhood. But then it was our turn. My lawyer stood and, with practiced confidence, began dismantling their case, piece by piece. He held up the State Solar Access Act. He pointed directly to the section that prohibited HOAs from banning solar panels outright. Then he produced federal energy documents that encouraged renewable adoption, showing that what the HOA was doing was not only unlawful, but directly opposed to national policy. And then came the knockout punch. I was called to the stand. My hands shook as I placed them on the railing, but my voice was steady. I described the letters, the fines, the threats of a lien. I showed the photographs of my vandalized car and the intimidating notes left at my door. I explained how other families had been forced out before me. And finally, I presented the records that ties between the HOA president's consulting firm and the energy company that stood to profit from keeping solar out of our neighborhood. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Even the judge's eyebrows shot up. The HOA's attorney tried to object, but it was too late. The evidence was damning. They weren't just enforcing rules, they were abusing power for personal gain. After hours of testimony, the judge delivered his ruling. His voice was firm, deliberate, and every word felt like justice being carved into stone. The HOA's actions are unlawful under state and federal law. Their attempts to fine, intimidate, and file a lien against the homeowner are invalid and void. Furthermore, the evidence suggests bad faith and possible corruption within the board. This court orders all fines removed, the lien dismissed, and the HOA to pay damages for harassment. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Just like that, it was over. The board members sat frozen, their power crumbling before them. The president's face was pale, his lips pressed thin, as though he had just watched his empire collapse. My lawyer patted me on the shoulder. "You just made history in this community," he whispered. Outside the courthouse, neighbors gathered around me. Some clapped me on the back, others simply said thank you with tears in their eyes. For years, they had been living under fear, and now, for the first time, they saw that fear broken. Within weeks, 2 board members resigned. An investigation was launched into the president's financial dealings, and eventually, he too stepped down in disgrace. The HOA was forced to rewrite its policies, and not just on solar panels. Homeowners now had more freedom, more voice, and more power than they ever had before. As for me, my solar panels went up without another word of resistance. I stood in my driveway one morning, watching the sunlight gleam off them, and I felt something I hadn't felt in months: peace. But more than that, I felt pride. Not just because I won, but because I didn't let them bully me into silence. Because I proved that one homeowner, armed with truth and persistence, could take on an entire HOA and win. And as I looked around my neighborhood at the families who now walked with their heads a little higher, at the neighbors who waved with genuine warmth again, I realized something important. Sometimes standing up for yourself isn't just about you. Sometimes it's about giving everyone else the courage to stand up to dot. So if you ever find yourself facing a bully, whether it's an HOA or anyone else, remember this: you have more power than you think. And the moment you stop being afraid is the moment they start losing. That's what I learned. And that's how I proved my HOA was breaking federal energy laws. Thanks for watching. Hoped you liked it. If you watched till the end, please comment "end" so that we could understand you were with us till the end. As well as, please let us know, where are you watching from? Before leaving, please hit the subscribe button, comment your thought, and share with your nearest and dearest one. See you in the next one. Until to the next one, stay happy. Goodbye.